In March 1985, in a quiet room inside the Kremlin, the most powerful job in Soviet foreign policy changed hands. For almost 3 decades, the face of that policy had been Andrei Gromyko, the dour, stone-faced diplomat the West called Mr. Net. He had embodied a Cold War posture of confrontation, suspicion, and rigid ideological talking points. Now, in a move that stunned even seasoned Kremlin watchers, Mikhail Gorbachev replaced him with someone few people outside the Soviet Union had ever heard of, Eduard Shevardnadze, the party boss from the small Republic of Georgia. To many in Moscow, this seemed absurd. Shevardnadze was not a career diplomat. He had made his name cleaning up corruption in Tbilisi, not negotiating arms control in Geneva. But Gorbachev saw in him what he needed, a loyal ally, untainted by the old foreign policy establishment, willing to do something unprecedented in Soviet history, work with the West from inside the Soviet system to end the Cold War instead of prolonging it. Eduard Ambrosevich Shevardnadze was born in 1928 in the village of Mamati in western Georgia. He joined the Komsomol Youth League and the Communist Party as a young man and climbed the ladder not through Moscow ministries, but through the Georgian party apparatus and interior ministry. In the 1970s, he became first secretary of the Georgian Communist Party, effectively the republic's leader. There, he built a reputation as an anti-corruption crusader, purging entrenched networks and trying to modernize an ossified system. Gorbachev noticed. When Gorbachev became General Secretary in March 1985, he needed people who could help him change both the Soviet economy and its place in the world. The old guard in the foreign ministry, led by Gromyko, was deeply invested in a confrontational approach to the United States and NATO, an approach that had yielded an arms race, proxy wars, and a stagnant militarized Soviet economy struggling to keep up with American technology. Shevardnadze, though inexperienced in diplomacy, had shown he was willing to challenge entrenched interests. Gorbachev took the risk and brought him to Moscow as foreign minister. From his first contacts with Western leaders, it was clear that this was not Mr. Net. The National Security Archive holds transcripts of Eduard Shevardnadze's early meetings with U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, starting in 1985. The tone is startling compared to the scripted ideological exchanges of earlier decades. Shevardnadze acknowledged Soviet economic troubles, spoke of the need to reduce the risk of nuclear war, and talked about the future in terms of common interests rather than only class struggle. He did not sound like a man rehearsing propaganda. He sounded like a politician trying to solve real problems. For American diplomats, this was both fascinating and disorienting. For decades, the United States had poured trillions into defense and technology, Minuteman missiles, B-52s and B-1s, Polaris and Trident submarines, early warning satellites, global communications networks, and a NATO infrastructure built around integrated command and control. Under Ronald Reagan, Washington had publicly floated even more ambitious concepts, like the Strategic Defense Initiative, which suggested a future in which American space-based systems might one day neutralize Soviet missiles. Behind the rhetoric, the reality was simple. The U.S. economy and technology base were outpacing the Soviet Union, and leaders in Moscow knew it. Shevardnadze was one of those leaders. In private conversations with Shultz and later with James Baker, he linked arms control directly to the survival of reform at home. Demilitarization, he argued, was essential if the Soviet Union was to rebuild its economy and avoid collapse. Without relief from the arms race, there would be no perestroika. It was an extraordinary admission, a Soviet foreign minister telling his American counterpart that the USSR could not afford to keep up with U.S. military and technological advances and needed a way out. Over the next several years, Shevardnadze and Shultz developed a partnership that went beyond protocol. They met frequently in Helsinki, Geneva, Washington, Moscow, and used those meetings not just to exchange official positions, but to test ideas, build trust, and create a shared vocabulary for de-escalation. They talked about intermediate-range missiles in Europe, human rights cases, regional conflicts like Afghanistan and Nicaragua, and the broader question of how to move from confrontation to what both sides began to call a Europe whole and free. From the American side, these conversations were backed by formidable analytic and technical resources. Arms control negotiators came to the table with precise data on warhead numbers, missile ranges, and verification capabilities. They could point to satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and national technical means to show what they knew about Soviet deployments. They could demonstrate how on-site inspections, telemetry sharing, and other verification measures would work. For Shevardnadze, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. He could see that American negotiators were confident in their facts. He could also see that if the Soviet Union agreed to robust verification, it could gain credibility and relief in return. The first major breakthrough came with the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF. After years of tension over Soviet SS-20s and U.S. Pershing II and cruise missiles in Europe, Shevardnadze helped push the Soviet side to accept not just limits, but elimination. The INF Treaty, signed in 1987 by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles, the first time the two superpowers agreed to abolish a whole category of weapons. Shevardnadze was in the room and at the negotiating table for the complex technical discussions that led to that moment, translating Gorbachev's political will into concrete terms U.S. experts could accept. This achievement stunned hardliners in Moscow. For decades, Soviet doctrine had treated nuclear forces in Europe as essential leverage against NATO and the technologically superior U.S. military machine. Giving up missiles on that scale looked like surrender to some generals. But Shevardnadze and Gorbachev calculated that the Soviet Union could no longer afford escalation, especially against an adversary whose economy was producing more advanced systems year after year. As INF moved forward, the two sides also laid foundations for START, a series of strategic arms reduction talks. These negotiations dragged on and would not fully conclude until after Shevardnadze left office, but he set key parameters: deep cuts in strategic warheads and delivery systems, intrusive verification, and a recognition that both sides had a shared interest in reducing the risk of accidental or unauthorized launch. Again, American technical capacities, early warning systems, NTM, data analysis, made it possible to design verification regimes that gave Washington confidence in Soviet compliance. Shevardnadze understood that, far from being a threat, this transparency could help lock in a more stable relationship and free resources for domestic reform. While arms control dominated headlines, other changes were underway. Shevardnadze believed that a genuine end to the Cold War required more than treaties. It required changes on the ground. One of his early tests was Afghanistan. Since 1979, the Soviet Union had been bogged down in a brutal war in Afghanistan, fighting Mujahideen fighters armed in part by U.S. and Pakistani channels. The war drained Soviet resources, damaged its international image, and became a symbol of the limits of the Soviets' ability to project power in a world where local insurgents could use Western-supplied weapons and tactics against a cumbersome Soviet-style military. Shevardnadze was among those in the leadership who argued that the war was unwinnable and that the USSR needed to withdraw. Under his tenure, Soviet troops pulled out, with the last leaving in February 1989.
This withdrawal signaled to the West and to allies and clients around the globe that the Soviet Union was no longer willing to pay any price to uphold its positions. It was part of a broader shift, encouraged and reinforced by Western diplomatic pressure and the knowledge that the U.S., with its global logistics, precision weapons, and alliances, could sustain far-flung operations in ways the Soviet economy simply could not match. The same pattern emerged in Eastern Europe. In previous decades, the Soviet Union had invaded Hungary, 1956, and Czechoslovakia, 1968, to crush reforms. Now, under Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the Kremlin adopted what Western analysts called the Sinatra Doctrine, letting Warsaw Pact countries do it their way. Shevardnadze argued that maintaining control of Eastern Europe at gunpoint was economically unsustainable and politically disastrous. He supported the idea that each socialist state should choose its own path. When popular movements in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and other Eastern Bloc states pushed for free elections and reform, Soviet troops did not roll. This decision shocked communist hardliners and encouraged pro-democracy forces that had doubted Moscow's restraint. Western leaders saw it as proof that there was a real strategic shift underway in the Kremlin, not just rhetoric, but orders that told Soviet commanders to hold back, even as NATO and Western media watched every move with satellite eyes and television cameras. Perhaps nowhere was Shevardnadze's impact more visible than in the story of German reunification. For 40 years, Germany had been divided, a front line between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Soviet ideology had treated West Germany as a bastion of U.S. militarism and East Germany as a socialist buffer. As the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the possibility of a united Germany emerged, the question of its alignment became critical. Western leaders, particularly West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and U.S. President George H.W. Bush, wanted a unified Germany inside NATO. Many Soviet generals and hardliners saw this as intolerable, giving a powerful, technologically advanced Western state full membership in what they still viewed as a hostile alliance. Shevardnadze, however, saw the longer game. The 2+4 talks involving the two German states and the four occupying powers, US, USSR, Britain, France, became the forum where this question would be settled. As foreign minister, Shevardnadze represented Moscow. According to Western accounts and later analyses, he was instrumental in persuading Gorbachev that a unified Germany in NATO was not only acceptable but advantageous if accompanied by the right security and economic arrangements. Here, back-channel diplomacy and American assurances played a key role. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker's memoirs and archival studies show that Baker, Bush, and their advisors carefully crafted messages to Shevardnadze and Gorbachev that emphasized adaptation, not triumph. They spoke of NATO transforming itself, of strengthening pan-European structures like the CSCE, and of building a post-Cold War order with no winners and no losers. Drafts of NATO's 1990 London Declaration, which promised to change the alliance's character and seek deeper partnership with the Soviet Union, were anticipated and sometimes effectively pre-briefed so that Shevardnadze's team could respond positively without being outflanked by hardliners in Moscow. From the American side, these assurances were backed by confidence in U.S. capabilities. Washington knew that its conventional forces, its nuclear triad, and its technology base gave it a strong hand in any long-term security competition. It could afford to be generous because the underlying balance of power was shifting decisively in its favor. For Shevardnadze, the choice was stark: cling to an unraveling empire and risk confrontation with a technologically superior West, or accept a new security architecture that acknowledged American and NATO strength but offered the Soviet Union a dignified exit from confrontation. He chose the latter. Under his guidance, the Soviet Union agreed to German reunification, accepted that unified Germany would remain in NATO, and negotiated the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Eastern Germany. It was a geopolitical earthquake, accomplished without war. All the while, Shevardnadze continued to work closely with his American counterparts. Under the Bush administration, he and James Baker spoke frequently. During the 1990-1991 Gulf crisis, they coordinated responses to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. UPI noted that they were in near constant telephonic contact at the height of the crisis. The fact that Washington and Moscow could work together in the UN Security Council to oppose aggression in the Persian Gulf was another sign of how far the relationship had changed, from enemies poised on a nuclear hair trigger to partners defending a basic rule of international order. But the transformation Shevardnadze helped engineer was not universally welcomed in Moscow. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, hardliners in the Communist Party, the military, and the KGB grew increasingly alarmed. They saw the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the loosening of control over Eastern Europe, the INF Treaty, the acceptance of German reunification, and the de-escalation with the US as a series of humiliations. They blamed Gorbachev and Shevardnadze for giving away the gains of decades without securing enough in return. At the same time, nationalist movements inside the Soviet Union, especially in the Baltic republics like Lithuania, were pushing for independence. In 1990, Lithuania declared its independence from the USSR. Shevardnadze found himself trying to explain to American leaders why the Soviet government was invoking presidential authority and even considering force to deal with protests and seizures of factories. Bush and Baker pressed him to find political solutions and avoid violent crackdowns, reminding him that the U.S. had never recognized the Soviet annexation of the Baltics. Shevardnadze was caught between Western expectations and domestic hardliners who saw any concession as a dangerous precedent. On December 20, 1990, Eduard Shevardnadze resigned as foreign minister. He did so publicly and dramatically, warning that a dictatorship is coming to the Soviet Union. His resignation shocked observers in Moscow and abroad. For 5 years, he had been one of the primary faces of Soviet reform and of a new relationship with the West. Now he was stepping aside and sounding an alarm about forces within the system that wanted to reverse course. In hindsight, his warning was prescient. In August 1991, hardliners in the KGB, the military, and the party attempted a coup against Gorbachev. They failed, thanks in part to resistance led by Boris Yeltsin and popular mobilization, but the attempt accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the end of that year, the USSR was gone. From Washington's perspective, the Cold War had ended without a shot between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and much of the credit for that peaceful outcome went to people like Eduard Shevardnadze.
When he died in 2014, obituaries in Western media called him a towering figure who helped open the Soviet Union to the West and played a central role in ending the Cold War. The National Security Archive described him as a foreign minister who brought candor and a new style that transformed U.S.-Soviet relations. Analysts at Carnegie and elsewhere argued that without Shevardnadze's willingness to work intimately with Shultz and Baker, to accept painful compromises on arms and Eastern Europe, and to use back-channel diplomacy to manage hardliners at home, the Cold War might have ended much more violently. In Georgia, his legacy was more complicated. After the Soviet collapse, he returned to Tbilisi, leading the country as head of the State Council and later as president. He initially brought stability after chaos and civil war, gaining Western support and aid, but over time his rule became associated with corruption, stagnation, and heavy-handed tactics. In 2003, the Rose Revolution, a peaceful protest movement against rigged elections and misrule, forced him to resign. The man who had helped dismantle one system now struggled to build a better one at home. For your audience, though, the core of Eduard Shevardnadze's story lies in those 5 years in the late 1980s when a Georgian party boss became the Soviet foreign minister and quietly decided to steer his country out of a struggle it could no longer win. He did not do this because he loved the West or hated socialism. He did it because he could see, more clearly than many around him, just how far behind the Soviet Union had fallen in economic, technological, and military terms. He knew American factories, laboratories, and universities were producing things the Soviet system could not match. He watched U.S. satellites circle the globe, U.S. computers revolutionize code breaking, and U.S. industries put cutting-edge technologies into both civilian and military use. In that context, secret communication with Western rivals was not betrayal, it was realism. By building personal trust with Shultz and Baker, by listening to American briefings on verification, and by accepting that NATO would remain and that a unified Germany could be part of it, Shevardnadze helped design a peaceful exit from a confrontation the Soviet Union was doomed to lose if it continued on its old path. The pride for American viewers comes in recognizing what that choice implies. A man who had spent his life inside the Soviet elite, who had every reason to defend the system that gave him power, looked at the balance of forces, economic, technological, and political, and decided that cooperation on Western terms was better than continued rivalry. He did not announce this in slogans. He showed it in the treaties he signed, the withdrawals he oversaw, and the walls he allowed to fall. Eduard Shevardnadze's story is a reminder that the Cold War was not only won by missiles and tanks, but by the power of a free society's technology, economy, and ideas to convince even its adversaries that the future lay in partnership, not in endless competition. In the end, the Soviet foreign minister who began his career enforcing the will of a closed system became one of the key architects of that system's peaceful end, in no small part because the United States gave him, through its strength and its diplomacy, a path he could take without war.